right, so I'd like to welcome everybody and thank you all for joining us for this webinar discussion on looking back at 250, Virginia and the Revolution. I'm Elliott Drago. I'm the resident historian and manager of network engagement at the Jack Miller Center, an organization committed to education and the principles of the American founding and their place in our history. And with our partners at JMC, we seek to strengthen this foundational civic education in three important ways. We support and empower a growing network of professors who teach the American political tradition. We leverage that network for the benefit of K-12 civics and history teachers. And we convene leaders, practitioners, and funders to build a diverse coalition committed to a true renaissance of civic education in our country. You can learn more about all of what we're up to on our website, jackmillercenter.org, and I encourage you to check it out. But here today, we are going to talk about Virginia's place in the Revolution, and we're here to look back at Virginia and the Revolution as we move closer to America 250. Some of the questions we'll explore include the political context within Virginia, the role that George Washington and other Virginia founders played during these crucial moments, as well as some of the best firsthand accounts or primary sources we can read to better understand our forebears and the high stakes of independence. So the format of our meeting is going to be 30 minutes of interview style conversation and about 15 minutes of Q&A. We're going to open up questions at the end of our talk, so please have them ready or drop them in the public chat. Joining us today to discuss these questions and much, much more is Dr. Douglas Bradburn, President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon and the former founding director of the George Washington Presidential Library. A well-known scholar of early American history, he has written The Citizenship Revolution, Politics and the Creation of the American Union, 1774 to 1804, and three anthologies, including Early Modern Virginia, Reconsidering the Old Dominion. He co-founded and is the editor of a book series, Early American Histories, and is the winner of numerous awards, grants, and fellowships, including the Gilder Lehrman Research Fellowship at the Robert H. Smith International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, 5 Telly Awards, and a Thea Award. He has been featured on C-SPAN, Good Morning America, CBS Sunday Morning, and the History Channel docudrama, Washington. Before his tenure at Mount Vernon, he served as the chair of the history department at Binghamton University, State University of New York. Dr. Bradburn holds a PhD in history from the University of Chicago and a BA in history and economics from the University of Virginia. Beautiful. Is there anything you'd like to tell us about before we get started here, Doug?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you for the work of the Jack Miller Center, really to support education, civic education, history education has done so much for so long, and we're honored to be partners with you here at Mount Vernon and in many ways in our effort to make sure that Americans are educated about our unique institutions and our responsibility as citizens to pass them down to each generation a little bit better than they received them. So love to look forward to this talk, and I know we'll talk more about our work at Mount Vernon later on.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So let's begin by setting the stage a bit. Can you give us a sense maybe of the political context within Virginia that was shaping contemporary views of independence in early 1776?
Well, I love that setup. I mean, if we take the 250, seriously, and we transport ourselves back 250 years, you're really looking at right now, obviously it would be 1775 in May, and a critical thing has just happened. George Washington has left Mount Vernon to go to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, where he will be appointed the first commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. We're a month or so after Lexington and Concord. That news swept through Virginia and, basically ignited the tinder that had been growing here for many years, all the way back to the Stamp Act crisis in 1765, where Virginia took a leading role. The Townsend duties, where Virginia's led the way in describing, an opposition through boycotts. And then, of course, the First Continental Congress, leading up to this past March, the mobilizing of the military in Virginia was ongoing right now, following Patrick Henry's famous "Give him liberty, give him death" speech. That's in March of 1775. And that led to basically a vote, a resolution that the colony would start arming for war and creating these independent companies, of which George Washington already was put in command of over 6 of those. He already had designed his famous buff and blue uniform. And then, of course, if we go, a year later, you're going to be in the midst of war, in Boston and other places, and in Virginia, it's basically in the middle of a civil war. Lord Dunmore, by this point, has fled the colony, and the Virginians have come together in what they call their Fifth Convention. It's basically an extra legal government, essentially, to replace the royal government. And that Fifth Convention is one of the most significant gatherings of legislators, of revolutionary leaders in world history. Because out of it, I know you know this, Elliott, but everybody online, I hope, knows this as well. Out of it comes some incredible seminal things. The on this day, May 15th, the 249 years ago, they in 1776, May 1776, the Virginia Fifth Convention tells their delegates in Philadelphia that they want them to get a resolution passed at the Constitution at the Continental Congress to declare that the Virginia and the colonies are independent states, free and independent states. Ultimately, that leads to Richard Henry Lee on June 7th, 1776, in Philadelphia. The great Virginian Richard Henry Lee makes that motion, which leads directly to the Declaration of Independence. It also leads directly to the call from the Continental Congress for the colonies to start creating governments. And that's another thing that happens at this Fifth Virginia Convention. They create the Virginia Constitution, written by George Mason, right here on the water of Potomac. And Mason has an incredible Declaration of Rights, which are approved before the Constitution as a way to establish what are the fundamental rights of individuals in Virginia. And this is really, it shatters the monarchical world, the passage of this. They abandon the idea of hereditary titles. They abandon the notion that there'll be a monarchy. They set forward aggressively that there's natural rights of equality, of the freedom of the press, religion, so many of the rights that we've come to think of as our American rights. Those are laid out first in Virginia in that Declaration of Rights, a declaration that's going to go on to influence every other Declaration of Rights in the colonies, the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen in France, and then, of course, their Constitution itself, which establishes a Commonwealth. So no monarchy, it's a republic. It has 2 branches of government. It's sort of conservative in the way they put it together. The voting rights are restricted to property owners, and there's some liberalization of religious laws, but a lot has yet to be done. So that's the context. You've got kind of a conservative movement on the old Tidewater elite planters of the southern part of Virginia. You've got these more radical, more diverse, religiously diverse, from what we think of as the west of Virginia. Patrick Henry is coming from, the western counties. Even beyond them are a lot of new migrants into Virginia, in many cases from Pennsylvania. You've got Dutch, Scots, Irish, different languages being spoken, different religions being practiced. You've also got, the classic frontiersmen who've just returned from a war in what's now Kentucky that opened up that whole Kentucky for settlement. So you got a lot of pressures happening. And then you have 40% of the colony is enslaved. So you have slavery as a dominant form of economy in the Commonwealth. So it definitely matches that incredible paradox of American liberty and enthusiasm for new ideas of freedom and liberty. At the same time, you have ancient institutions of bondage that are in action and robust. So it sets the stage for the drama of the great creation of the modern world.
Excellent. So I have a question. So when these conventions meet, sometimes we get the sense from other founders that there was always trepidation, right? That we know living 250 years later that it all worked out. Of course, they, like us, couldn't see the future. So is there any sense, could you maybe talk a little bit about some of maybe the intra-colonial divisions within Virginia that speak to this trepidation, the idea of hanging together or hanging separately? I mean, that must have weighed on their minds.
Oh, absolutely. A couple things. One is it was important for the Virginians, as it was at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, led by a big group of Virginians, including Thomas Jefferson was in Philadelphia, that the colonies form governments at the same time they declare independence. They were very much wary of anarchy. So this idea, like
Mm.
you can't just declare you're independent. You have to have a structure of governance in place. That was the feeling, at least, but to kind of contain the impulses of just breaking things. You can rebel and you can break the established order, but unless there's something else that's replacing it, you can lead to all kinds of trouble. So that was definitely a concern. Like in the 18th century, men of property would say leveling, right? They look back to a
Mhm.
history they tell themselves about the English Civil War, these levelers, the idea that all property rights would disappear. Well, if you've overthrown the government, then maybe there's no law and order, and you can just run around and do whatever you want. And these guys were very much property owners, many of them slave owners. They have a very strong interest in not having anarchy, but they want their own liberty and they want ordered liberty. And so that was the movement to create these constitutions, these state constitutions, which in their way become, I mean, they really transform the way the West starts thinking about fundamental law and how you create an ordered society. And they had really been mostly philosophical abstractions, this idea of a
Mhm.
constitutional moment. As you know, the British had a unwritten constitution. So
Right.
there weren't moments where you have these kind of state of nature moments where everybody comes together, writes the rules that are going to govern their society, the Constitution, and then puts them into place. And so in Virginia, they do it in a way that doesn't become the accepted norm. So this convention basically writes a constitution, approves it, they elect a governor, and then they're off and running. And the tensions in the colony were between more radical ideas about voting rights, about religious freedom, about the structure of the government. So, for instance, the government that they create in Virginia has two houses. It's bicameral in the Constitution that George Mason wrote. And the idea is that you're going to have an upper house, which has people with higher property levels in it, that is going to be kind of a stabilizing force, and a lower house that's representative of more people. And that kind of that lower upper house is an effort to moderate the potential for radical legislation, radical democracy. The idea of
Right.
Athenian democracy, or that is just you know it'll go crazy, it'll get oligarchy, and then they're trying to create balance and all that sort of thing. So there's an ideological conflict, and some of that is not based on socioeconomics, but a lot of it is. But then you also have, I said, these kind of ethnic differences and religious differences in Virginia that have to always be part of the story. The Virginia, the Old Dominion, has got an established church that's an Anglican church. It's Church of England. Everybody pays taxes to it. Everybody's
Mhm.
moral lives is governed by it. So you can't get married legally, Elliott, unless it's by a Church of England. You can't, you could be brought to church for fornication, and have to wear a white sheet. This is part of the society. But in the same time, you've got growing denominations of Presbyterians and other dissenters, and they have some rights, but they are very restricted, and they still have to pay taxes to support the local Anglican Church. So this is something that you're going to see open up in the course of the American Revolution in Virginia. These dissenting groups asking for more and more liberty, asking for more and more rights, which will ultimately culminate in the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom in 1786, which completely disestablishes the church and creates the idea of a separation of church and state. So that's a lot. I went on and on.
Yeah. No.
There are a lot
No.
of
No.
tensions within the colony.
Right, because it's interesting how we talk about the divisions, but there's also unifying forces. I guess I have one more quick question on the conventions in general. Um, when we think of the Constitutional Convention, for example, right,
Yeah.
we see everybody well ordered, sitting, talking. We see modern political conventions, and it's not that at all. It's pretty raucous. So, what would you say, or how would you describe maybe to a student what is going on in a typical Virginia convention with these men that
Yeah.
you've discussed? Is it raucous? Is it normal? What is it like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it's more raucous than we would imagine, in the sense that they're all sitting sort of orderly in desks with the speaker up there, kind of moving the debate around. In fact, there's going to be a lot of motion. There's going to be a lot of people going from desk to desk, lobbying for their
Yeah.
particular point of view. There's going to be a lot of people out of doors in Williamsburg, Virginia. They're meeting in the Capitol, but a lot of times they're going into the taverns. Raleigh Tavern has been an important place where different factions will meet. So there's a whole energy in the whole city around what's going on there. It's a time where people are doing market business. It's a time where they're doing county business. It's a time where they're buying and selling horses. I mean, there's all kinds of things going on, and in the midst of this, they're mobilizing for war. So
Right.
it is a I think it's a dramatic scene. We don't have a lot of description of the inside of the Virginia Convention. We do know that these men were very experienced meeting together in legislative bodies of various kinds,
Mm.
bodies. They had a lot of experience. Although, I will say, the great Declaration of Rights, which is so impactful, written by George Mason, who was not an attorney. He had no training in the law. He was just a deep reader. And that's probably one of the reasons it was so dramatic and different and radical in its way, because no lawyer trained in British common law would have written it.
Right.
But anyway, yeah. So I think you also had the Virginia Convention and 18th century conventions in general. I mean, oratory was a thing. It was a really important thing. Like these men, they lived in an oral age. These men were expected to be able to get up there and sway opinion with brilliant oratory. And of course, Patrick Henry was known for this, and he was part of that convention. He's in fact elected the first governor. He represents
Mm.
the West. He represents also dissenters, Presbyterians particularly. He's involved with the creation of this new college, Hampton-Sydney College, which is a Presbyterian-led movement. And so he's sympathetic to liberalizing the rules of religion. And so, he's giving all kinds of speeches, with liberty on his. He's the "Give Me Liberty" guy. I mean, and
Right.
so I think the convention would have been a lot. It would have been very interesting to watch, not dull, not like a plotting kind of, a bunch of guys in wigs. I mean, I think it would have been much more engaging.
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, that's great. I mean, just the lively nature of it that I don't think people think about.
There's about
That's
128 people there.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. Who know each other from
Yeah,
for ages. Right. Right. Um,
yeah.
so let's pick maybe a famous Virginian you've heard of. Believe it's pronounced George Washington. So George Washington, at what point did you realize in your life that you wanted to study that man and
Yeah.
that bust? Yeah. Now, at what point? Was, Tell us
So
about it.
that's a good. I mean, Elliot, that's a really good question. I mean, for me, as like all Americans, I grew up, with George Washington sort of being a fact of life and being a larger than life figure. He's on the dollar bill, and when I was a kid, the dollar bill meant a lot, and a quarter, even a quarter, meant a lot to get it in your hands. But he's sort of ever present for an American who grows up here as this commanding figure. Our capital is named Washington. And so anyone who kind of grows up here has that. But on the other hand, he's quite abstract. Um, I really fell in love with the history of the Revolution probably when I was in high school. I mean, I read a lot of history. Read a lot of Roman history and
Mm.
medieval history and knights and stuff like that when I was a kid. And I grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, and really got into the history of
Oh,
the
wow.
British Empire. And Washington just looms so large. So he was always a part of the stories that I wanted to tell. I've always felt that for an American historian, the stories of the founding, have a particular power and salience in this great experiment in self governance, which we are a part of. But I will admit, it really wasn't until I became the founding director of George Washington's Presidential Library that I started to focus on Washington. I was looking at citizenship and the politics of the founding more broadly, and he's a figure in that. But a lot of the sophisticated work, is on Jefferson, it's on Hamilton's ideas. When you look at the founders' work, and Washington's work has been, his biographies are great, and there's many of them. But great man history has fallen out of favor, and
Hmm.
people don't you go around like thinking about, wow, the leadership of Washington. Let's really dig into it. When you're in a graduate seminar, it's just not the thing, right?
Right.
So it
Right.
was when I got here, that I really got immersed in his papers. And one of the things, Elliot, that we have in Mount Vernon, which is extraordinary, is we have his library and his
Oh.
books. And so Washington's father dies when he's 10 years old, 11 years old. He has reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their family can't afford to send him to an English school like his older brothers, half brothers, had gone. And so he never has a proper gentleman's education in the 18th century. He's not classically trained. And so he's trained up, through his life. Becomes a surveyor. He's buying books on geography and mathematics. He starts becoming a military officer. He starts acquiring books on military science. As the revolution, the arguments over parliamentary rights, he starts acquiring books on English law and English history. And then eventually, adding to this over a life of curious lifelong learning, he becomes really obsessed with agricultural reform in the 1780s. He starts acquiring everything he can on that. And so when you look at him through the lens of his education, and think about him as a man that's constructing his own, understanding of the world, I think it becomes eminently fascinating. And I will say the great things that he writes are letters. His correspondence is really extraordinary. From an active public life where he's constantly writing. I mean, he's in positions of leadership from age 21 until
Mm.
age 60, 5 or 60, 64 or 5 or 6 or something like that, and then beyond that as well, actually until his death. So he develops a real style and a powerful mind in really understanding what he believes and learning to listen to others. So again, a rambling thing, but Washington, I've become an obsessive zealot as I've been here at Mount Vernon, as I live at the place that he loves so much.
Well, in terms of his leadership skills, were there any instances that you could point to that kind of said that is the epitome of Washington leadership right there?
Mm.
Specific life moments, maybe in the heat of battle, maybe on the heat of sitting in a chair and convening people.
Yeah.
Do you have any good examples of his leadership skills in action?
Oh yeah, I mean, he was described as calm as a bishop at prayer at Yorktown when he's standing on the parapet, with a telescope, and bombs are exploding all around him, and his aides are losing their mind, like they're going to lose the great man, and he's just completely his personal courage and valor in the face of physical danger is something that had shown out from the very beginning. But when I think of his leadership, one of the things I like to emphasize is humility.
Mm.
And it goes back to his somewhat insecurity about his own education, but he is very much willing to listen first. He's not going to be the smartest man in the room. And so it begins really, you start seeing it in the war councils that he has when he's a general, where he listens to the officers about what they should do. He tries to build consensus. He's very different from the way a British war council is happening across the river at Trenton, for instance, where Cornwallis is gathering his officers and he's telling them what's going to happen the next day, whereas Washington's gathering his and saying, "What should we do?" Listening, and ultimately getting a consensus and then putting it into execution. It's how he does it as the president in his cabinet, where he's got very brilliant men around him, and he's still not, but he's the one they're all looking to. He's the leader, and so he'll have them debate, he'll have them argue it out, and so when he makes a decision, he's confident that he's heard from all voices, heard from all sides, and with the best of his ability, making the judgment. And that's what all the people that served with him talk about, his extraordinary judgment. Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, the John Marshall, the British ambassador. They talk about his statesmanship and judgment, and I think a lot of that comes from humility. One final thing
Mm.
I'll say about humility is it's not popular today. Obviously, everybody is posting themselves on the Facebooks and the Instaface and the Instagram and all that. But Washington, he humility can be a very powerful leadership trait. It gives you the ability to try great things without your whole identity being wrapped in to their success.
Mm.
When he takes the commission 250 years ago next month as the commander in chief of the army, he tells the Congress, "I do not believe I'm qualified for this role." That usually isn't what you do in a job interview.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and he writes to his brother, "I think that this is beyond me." He's never led more than a brigade level army in the field, and that was 12 years before. and now he's going to be in charge of the whole strategy and the whole army, and an army that doesn't exist, and to fight Great Britain. Only a complete buffoon would think that they were up to it, but he's allowed to say he has the freedom to say that, and I think he believes it. Now, it fits with the convention of what they want to hear. They want to hear a man that's
Oh, right.
disinterested in power, right? So culturally, it's the right thing for him to do that. But I do think there were a lot of other generals in the American army who, well, Benedict Arnold's a good example when he was in charge in Philadelphia, pushing around all the officials, my way or the highway, gets himself into trouble. Washington's constantly deferring to civilian leadership, deferring to expertise, and that allows him to have incredible, powerful trust in which he can basically do what he needs to do and get it done. So humility can be a very powerful and active aspect of leadership.
Excellent. Yeah. So one of the other qualities that I picked up from what you're saying is prudence, right? The
Yeah.
idea that he was a prudent leader, and
Yes.
so I guess related to this prudence is, so there are educators on the line, right, watching, and obviously they have to teach the founders, the founding fathers. So
Yeah.
how do you balance the legacy of the founders with a critical understanding of their flaws?
Well, I think that I think helping the students understand the context of the 18th century is critical. That it wasn't the 21st century, and a lot of the things that we believe today about how they should have behaved relative to something like slavery, or how come every women didn't get the same rights immediately. We all think those things because of the legacy of the founders.
Right.
Without the Declaration of Independence, without these Bill of Rights, without these high ideals of liberty, without the idea of a self-governing nation that it can improve itself and progressively, has people advocated and fought for these expansion of rights. We're basically using concepts that they, for the first time, made potent in human governance in history. We're using their own concepts against them. It's kind of unbelievable. 250 years
Interesting.
later, we can say they're hypocrites because they didn't live up to the stuff that they had said. I mean, that's success to me. I mean, they
Hmm.
wanted a society in which these ideals could energize self-governance. That was the great thing that they created. Now, whether it fits our idea of what 21st century democracy should look like, I mean, that's more about us than them. And I think that is the real question
Right.
to pose to your students, is like, what are the things that you believe that you don't think you live up to? What are the things that you want to happen in the world that you can do to change them? What are the political limits that you face to get those things done? They're all working within a human reality of the need to win a war, create new governments, try to mobilize a polity so that they can live in security and peace. And I think that is a critical thing. I think also, I do think it is very important that the story of slavery and the revolution is put into a proper framework. This was a period of emancipation in world history. Massachusetts' constitution is interpreted in the Quock Walker case in 1782 to mean that all the enslaved people in Massachusetts are freed, because the Constitution says that all people are free and equal in the Constitution. That's taken out of George Mason's
Hmm.
language, his Bill
Hmm.
of Rights. Um,
Right.
that wouldn't have happened if the American Revolution hadn't happened. You don't get free states and slave states until the American Revolution. All the northern states had slavery before the American Revolution. All the states in the Atlantic world largely had it to some degree. And so these colonies becoming states led to the ending of slavery in the North. The gradual abolition laws, as flawed as they could be in the middle colonies, eventually would end slavery, creating an even clearer divergence between those states that kept it and those that didn't. And in Virginia's case, it was really a near run thing that came down to politics. In 1782, Virginia passes a law called they call it the partial emancipation of slavery. It allows masters for the first time to free their slaves without getting a special bill from the legislature. And it leads to the
Wow.
explosion of the free black community in the Chesapeake. It goes from 5,000 free blacks in 1776 by the census. By 1806, when these laws are going to be rescinded in Virginia, the population's like 55,000. And some of that's because enslaved people could earn the money to buy their freedom for the first time as well. So it isn't just like planter largesse, but a big Quaker movement. And so you get this free black community that didn't exist because of the American Revolution. And guess what? They become the phalanx of the advocates for Americans to live up to their ideals, as you well know, Elliot, in your work. So I think that if it's a history that's told, it's an exciting history about how the American Revolution is the beginning of a story of human freedom that without these founders would not have happened. And I believe very strongly that without George Washington, we don't have the United States of America. So I think that you need to look at his story, his context, where he's coming from, and also ask students to look at their own lives and what are the beliefs they have, and how they feel like they compromise in ways because they do and they have to. So anyway, that's it's
Yeah.
every student and person is different, but I would challenge them to move away from simplistic concerns about who is a villain and who's a hero, and really focus on the human character of the story, and what I see are some of the incredible outcomes that came out of it.
Excellent. Excellent. Sticking with the students for a second. So obviously, students have a lot of distractions at their hands
Yeah.
now. I know my 11-year-old twins love screens, and I rarely see their faces. So why is it important for students, or I guess just people in general, to visit physical locations when
Ah,
everything's online? So
yeah,
why go to an archive? Why go to a presidential library? Why go to Mount Vernon when I
yeah.
can just find it online? So how would you answer that question?
Well, I would say that's a sad human existence if you never go anywhere and you just live through your screens. I don't think that's possible quite yet, but I think that one of the things these I see in young people who come to Mount Vernon, and about 400,000 people come in school groups to Mount Vernon every year. It's 40% of our attendance, and they're obsessed with authenticity because they live in
Mm,
a world that's fake. They're constantly confronted by things they don't know what's real, what's true. They know people are posing and people are performing, and this is a place where real things happen, real important things, and these structures are authentic. They go back to the 18th century, and we're preserving them. And so I find, you know, the actual documents, the actual, bowls, the material culture, the clothing, the spaces, they're evocative. They can be inspiring in a way that it's hard to be inspired looking at a picture of something on a screen. You can learn
right.
a lot. Obviously, these devices are incredible tools and can help you learn a lot. But the tactile is also a way through into the brain, and it's a powerful memory that you create. It fulfills part of your soul to know that
Mm,
these things existed that are like the things in your life. There were
right.
bedrooms here. That you have a bedroom. There are things that connect you to the human realities of the people here, and I think that we as educators have a responsibility to encourage people, particularly in this age of anniversaries. This is our
Yes.
civic duty. Anniversaries focus the mind on these things. Start asking, well, why are they important? Oh, it's got this great anniversary, 250 years. Go to these places, see where things happen, and create lasting memories for yourself, for your family, for your students that they won't forget. Because I believe, as somebody who's devoted his life to education, that we put a lot up here, but you can get it to stick if you go through the heart. And inspiration comes from real, authentic stuff that people can interact with in a way that will touch them more than just through their eyeballs. I think the mind is a curious thing, and I do think that these places have a power. When I go down to the tomb of George Washington and stand there and I realize he's there. This man is there, 10 feet
Yeah.
away from me, entombed. And not only am I seeing, that tomb, but millions and millions of people have visited his tomb. So you're part of an experience that's not just your own. It's a collective community identity for Americans, certainly. Of this site as a pilgrimage site. And so I think you can hold both things in your mind. You can hold like the academic stories and the history and the complexity and all that, and at the same time say, without this man, we would live in a very different world today.
Excellent.
No,
Yeah.
no,
So
authenticity matters,
yeah.
though. I think.
No, yeah, no, I 100%. And so you're you're explaining walking down to Washington's tomb and feeling the feelings that you feel when you're at Washington's tomb. So this leads to a question I actually have on my sheet here. So imagine if you're walking back from his tomb and
Yeah.
George Washington himself appears out of the mist and he
God.
says, Douglas Bradburn, I will answer one question about my life. What would you ask him?
Oh my God, Elliot, that is it's a false. It is false to say this was on a list of questions surviving. I know that that's not the case. And I've been asked this sort of like, who would you have dinner with in the past? And
Right.
and Rubenstein always asks this question, what would you ask the guy? And I it's so funny because here at Mount Vernon, we have a million questions we want to know about, like what the house looked like and the wallpaper in this room and all these little things trying to get the
Yeah.
authenticity. And it wouldn't be that, it certainly wouldn't be that. I think I would probably ask him. God, I mean, there's so many things. I mean, he was the commander in chief of the army, the Constitutional Convention. He was the first president of the United States. I mean, the mysteries are legion with what are going through his mind. There's the question of slavery and so much there. So I do think, if I was going to ask him a political question, I would probably ask him who he thought should have been the second president of the United States at the beginning of his presidency. And, and because I firmly believe that he thought it should be Jefferson. And I
Interesting.
think that disappeared during the French and Indian War. If I was going to ask him a moral question, I would ask him about slavery,
Right.
and say, we want to understand today, like he freed the slaves that he owned in his will, and he tried in the 1790s to figure out a way to hire these English farmers who would rent his outlying farms and basically pay, kind of transition like the West Indies did, kind of like apprenticeship to then freedom, trying to figure out a gradual process. He couldn't, he never figured that out before he died. And so
Right.
really to get into his head, like, how did you think about this problem? Why didn't you, try to propose, something bigger on a national scale? Why didn't you use your moral authority in that way? I mean, I think I know what he would say, but that would be the moral question. I think there's a lot of personal questions about Martha, and there's a lot of mysteries, but it's not fair. One question, Elliot. Come on, what do you want? I'm going to
No,
unlock the Rosetta Stone. Like, if we only knew this one thing, we'd know George Washington's mystery.
it's the
It's not.
argument from silence, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's
so
very hard.
okay, I do have three
What would
questions.
you want to know? What would you want to know of George Washington? Like, where was that boarding
Mm,
house you built in D.C.?
what I want to know about what? I think I think I want to probably ask him about Ona Judge. That would probably, or Oni Judge. That might be an interesting. Uh,
Well, I mean, I think he went after her because Martha wanted him to. You know,
interesting. Yeah.
and Martha was personally affronted and furious about that, and she didn't have the same awakening around slavery as George Washington did. And Ona Judge was owned by the Custis family, so
Right.
Washington had a responsibility to that property to hand it on to the Custises. And so it wasn't, unlike say Hercules, who ran away from Washington, and there's no evidence
Yeah.
that he pursued him because Washington he would have gotten freed in Washington's by the terms of his will.
And
And
Hercules was his coachman.
he
Was he
was
his
his cook.
coachman?
He was his
His
chef,
cook. Okay,
his
chef.
presidential chef, actually. Yeah. So it was a big deal, but it's pretty clear that he didn't pursue him. And in fact, and maybe you'd say this is a difference in race, but we have a letter that we own in which he's told about one of his indentured servants that ran away, and he's told like where he is, and Washington says, I was going to free him anyway, so let him, I was going to let him out of his
Interesting.
contract anyway. So it's not clear exactly. I think on a judge is a Martha thing as much as a George thing, and then it
Right.
becomes a George thing. So, but anyway, yeah. But I think any questions are fair game around that.
So we have a question from an audience member that's similar. If you had to read one thing that Washington read, and this is good because you have had the privilege of reading
Yeah.
things that Washington has read where he read them. If you had to read one thing that Washington read that most reveals his outlook on life, which source or which book would that be from his library?
A book that reveals his outlook on life. That's a really interesting question. I mean, he definitely read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations,
Interesting.
which I think he was very influenced by um, Thomas Lord Fairfax and Colonel William Fairfax to embrace the at the time this ideal of civic virtue, self control, which is Marcus Aurelius is a part of that tradition and as well. I think that had a powerful impact on him. He practiced a kind of reading, a scriptural practice of meditations, where he would and this was typical of Anglicans in the 18th century, and very much, I think, part of the way he read was he would read a passage of scripture, or he would read a book, or read something like Aurelius, and then he would meditate on it, contemplate it,
Mhm.
think quietly, and think on it as a form of discipline, as a form of learning. And it's interesting in his diary after he signs the Constitution, the day September 17th, he writes in his diary, "I went home to contemplate on the incredible work that we accomplished." This idea that he went home after they finished the Constitution and just sat in meditation, kind of contemplation. That speaks to his sort of the method of reading. He doesn't he writes, he waxes philosophical occasionally, which is fun. And some of his own letters actually are where you kind of get more of that personality. He writes a great crazy letter to Lafayette in the late 1780s. I can't remember the exact date, but he talks about he sends Joel Barlow's poem Visions of Columbus to Lafayette. He's like, "You're gonna love this poem. It's all about the American Revolution, and I want let's spread it around." And he talks about how poets have made heroes, and heroes made poets, and how all the great men in history had their great
Oh, it's
poets,
interesting.
and he just goes on these things that just not very Washington. It's not the guy we think about, because he's always very kind of constrained. One of the greatest letters he ever writes is to a woman named Catherine Macaulay Graham, the great English historian who visits Mount Vernon. It's the day that he gives the first State of the Union address. He writes a letter to her in which he says, "I walk on untrodden ground. Everything I do is subject to two interpretations. Everything I do is making a president. This government, no one will understand how difficult it was to create this. It was to be a government of laws as well as accommodation. Much was to be done by prudence, much by firmness, much by conciliation." I mean, it's an incredible letter in which he talks about the challenges of leadership. He talks about how to lead. You got to know where you want to go, and there's a lot of ways to get there. Sometimes firmness, sometimes conciliation, sometimes prudence,
Mhm.
which might mean not doing anything. And and yet the art of leadership is knowing when to do it. So I don't it's hard to say there's a book in his library that gives us that pathway to the man. I think his correspondence is the way to him. Those kind of letters where he allows himself to be a little more expressive, a little more thoughtful. He's so restrained with us, with the reader, because he's keeping us at arm's distance, like he did with everybody in the 18th century. He'd been in command since the age of 21. And in the revolution, he really controls the kind of political world around him. And as president, the same thing. Everything is being adjudged that he's doing, and all the eyes are on him. So when he opens up, when we do get those few nuggets, it does give you, I think, an insight to a very powerful mind and a thoughtful man, who really managed the challenges of his life as best as he could through discipline, and really believed in the ideals of the kind of civic republicanism. Quoted from Cato,
Right.
Athens, Cato: "'Tis not in mortals to command success. You can do better. You can deserve it." He had the play performed at Valley Forge. I mean, this is
Right.
sort of the code of the revolutionary American. "Give me liberty, give me death" comes out of that. I wish I had more than one life to give for my country comes out of Cato. This is
Right.
sort
Right.
of his playbook of how to behave as a leader.
That's excellent. So we have another quick question here from Bryn Long. So And this is actually, I was going to ask this one too. What does Mount Vernon plan to do for the 250th anniversary next year?
Uh,
And what is Mount Vernon leadership hoping to do differently from maybe other commemorative celebrations?
Well, that's a great question. It's a long answer. I'll keep it short as I can. So I became the CEO of Mount Vernon in 2018, and one of the critical things I talked to the board about at that time was what do we want to be as an institution in the 250th anniversary of American independence, which even in 18 felt like a long way away, 2026. But out of that came really a lot of the things that we're working towards. We are in the midst of a major restoration of the Mansion House, the iconic Mansion House itself. $40 million restoration. We're rebuilding the foundation of the house, both the carpentry and the masonry. And we're also installing a new HVAC system. And then we will be restoring the cellar to what it looked like in the 18th century, which it's really never been a part of the experience of the house. And that's going to be phenomenal. Project, like I said, a $40 million project. It'll be complete in 2026. That was a critical thing. We are redoing our major exhibit on George Washington, the biography, the Education Center. It has a theater in it where it snows on you when you cross the Delaware with Washington. It's
Whoa,
40 theater. It's incredible.
that's great.
It's a brand new exhibit. It's really a brand new biography of George Washington, much more inclusive than we've ever had in there, incorporating Native American stories, all the research we've done on slavery, but also really focusing on George Washington's leadership, both through his kind of character and the aspects of his leadership through specific time, but then also a chronological journey into the 18th century worlds that he was shaped by and that he helped shape. So it is very exciting project that's also going to be opening in 2026. We've got a new
Mm.
food court opening in 2026. We're going to be doing teacher education around the country. We do teacher education at Mount Vernon every year, 160 K through 12 teachers here. We're going to be doing 50 programs around the nation with partners all over the presidential libraries, historic sites, in communities all over the country. And we have brand new educational resources that'll match our new education center exhibit as well. And then finally, I've been involved in our institution. We have to raise a lot of money. We don't receive any government funds or grants. And so we're building up our endowment. We're funding all these projects. And so my goal, Elliott, is that Mount Vernon and the 250th anniversary of American independence the house it will be as solid as it's ever been, more solid. We'll understand it better than we ever have. We'll have the strongest educational capability for people coming to Mount Vernon to learn all about the founding and George Washington in the most effective ways, to have a memorable, inspiring experience. And this will all be our birthday gift to the nation because, again, we don't take any taxpayer dollars. So this is all being done for America and to help us understand who we are. So I think that's different in the sense, that you can only do that at Mount Vernon. But I
Right,
will
right,
say we are partnering with Virginia 250 with a number of programs we've already done, America
right.
250 as well. We're doing some things there. I'm part of a coalition of people called More Perfect, which is trying to strengthen our democracy through 5 different goals. And Mount Vernon has helped convene people. As you know, we had, the Jack Miller Center led the convenings around civic education. So Mount Vernon is here to serve and to help and to raise awareness about this extraordinary holiday. Because again, I do think these anniversaries require us to teach. It is a civic responsibility to use those anniversaries to kind of light a fire under our citizenry to remind them that they should know that they are in charge in this nation.
Right.
The citizens run the show, and we got to teach that because kids just don't know that by being born.
Right. So, all right, I have a final question that kind of brings together your expertise in Washington, especially as letters, but also just speaking to the American political tradition as it stands. So, what is studying Washington? And if you have a specific letter in mind that maybe gets to the heart of your answer, please tell us. But what is studying Washington and the founding era in general taught you about America's political tradition?
Yeah. Well, Elliot, I mean, the classic thing I think is George Washington's farewell address is so critical today as much as any time. Here we are with a country where, people can't talk to their old friends because they like this particular guy in power or they didn't like the other guy. I mean, this has been a part of American history from the beginning. George Washington confronted it in his own cabinet. Letters to
Mm.
Alexander Hamilton saying, until men are governed by angels, we have to allow for differences of opinion. But the farewell address was an address from George Washington to the American people, which basically said, you can sum it up in one word, which is that our freedom and independence that we fought so much for will disappear if we give away our union. Unity and finding common ground is critical for the survival of this experimental form of government. And I do think that notion of an experimental government, which comes from George Washington, he called it the last great experiment in human history, is what he called the system under the Constitution. But the farewell address, it focuses on, obviously sectional differences. Don't believe that people from the West don't have interests of people in the East. Don't believe that people in the North and the South have different
Mm.
interests. Don't allow people to make you aliens to each other.
Right.
Think about the fact of what you share. And that was the thing that he constantly emphasized. I think union being critical to our liberty. Without union, we can't have the independence that we have. And that requires us to recognize that people are going to be different in this very diverse, very large union. And that's always been the case. So I think that is one critical message about our system that he wants us to reflect on. There's another great letter in a similar vein when he gave up his commission and went back to Mount Vernon at the end of the war. And George III claimed, if he was going to go back to a private situation after independence, he'd be the greatest man of the age. And he did that. And it was unbelievable because, Oliver Cromwell didn't do it. Napoleon couldn't do it. Stalin certainly didn't do it. The Castro brothers didn't do it. You can name any number of petty generalissimos who never gave up. Washington did. And it's allowed us to have, a country based on the rule of law. And so, he writes a letter. That's kind of the first farewell address. His last official circular address as commander in chief was to the governors, and it's called the Circular to the States, 1783. I recommend you Google it and read it
Mm.
alongside the farewell address because it's less known. It became known as his legacy before the Constitutional kind of changed the world. The Washington's legacy was a thing. It was read on the 4th of July with the Declaration of Independence. But in it, he writes, whether or not the revolution will be a blessing or a curse has yet to be determined. And that depends upon
Mhm.
what we do with it, what the American people do with it. This idea that the hardest part is yet to come. The eyes of the world are on us. We have nobody to blame but ourselves if we are not completely free and happy. The whole point of being an independent country is to be able to choose your own future. To be able to choose the future for your children. There's so many nations in the world that are fighting right now who don't have that choice. These guys won that for us. And
Mm.
Washington didn't tell us what to do with it. He said, if you screw it up, it's on you. It's on us. We are the ones who
Mm.
have this. And he talked about the decisions that they would make would affect millions unborn. It's an
Right.
incredible letter. It's an incredible
Right.
letter. And I would say that the decisions that we make, Elliot, right now at our 250th anniversary are going to affect millions unborn. And we need to take seriously the idea that we are in charge. We're not, we can't blame people who lived 250 years ago for the problems that we have in our society today. We're the ones in charge. And so I think that is the message that I think is the important thing about independence.
So, and I guess I love that response. I'm gonna sneak one more little question in here.
Oh,
So, you talk about the union, right? You talk about Washington as a unifying force. So how can organizations like yours, like ours, how can
yeah.
we use the 250th anniversary as a unifying moment as opposed to a moment that just exacerbates divisions?
Yeah. Boy, I mean, I think it's critical for us to do that for one thing, and I do think there has to be an aspect of celebrating. That
Mm.
we are we've survived. We made it. 250 years is a remarkable achievement to be an independent country. We had a major civil war in the midst of that, and there's been a lot of bumps along the way. But I think trying celebrating what we have in common. What are the common values that we have that have emerged from our stories of our own independence, the sort of parables of American freedom? So religious liberty. Everybody believes that people should be able to worship as their conscience in this country. That comes out of the founding era. The idea of civilian control of the military, that comes directly out of the founding era. That's George Washington's legacy. The idea that this is a country where the citizens are in charge, that comes out of the American Revolutionary era. I think that those are things that everybody agrees on in every party. We disagree on is sort of like the manifestation of these in policy, and these are important differences, and that's what we want to have in a free country. Is not everybody's going to agree, but we do have a lot that we agree on that come out of the stories of our independence fight, including the Constitution that we're still under, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights. I mean, these are fundamental to who we are. We are a country founded on principles, and those principles, are American now, and they're all of ours. So I think unity can be found in those kinds of stories, and you don't have to say, this country's perfect and has always done everything right. No country is. It's insane to think that. We're all human beings. So the other great thing we have is we have a phrase, embedded into our Constitution's preamble, the more perfect union. The idea that the union is, the Constitution was an effort to improve upon what they had, and that's every generation's opportunity. So let's use 250 to think about how we can collectively, together, as a country, as a community, improve upon what we've inherited. Take the good stuff, learn about the bad stuff, but take the good stuff and make better things. And if it's so easy to make it get it right, well, let's do it. So I don't have a lot of time for people who just want to really just cause strife to create strife. I think we have a responsibility to have rights of assent as well as dissent in this nation. There are purposes to unity that are powerful, and compromise isn't just a political tactic; it's a value. So, at any rate, you can live by that one just as much as being a crank.
Well, that's beautiful. So I just want to thank you, Doug, and obviously staff at Mount Vernon for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. I want to thank our audience members as well as our JMC communications team and our web guru, Anna Zematitis. This was a terrific conversation. I promised Doug I would give you I'll give you a chance to discuss your fellowship opportunities because I know we have a
Right.
number of scholars.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. You may or may not know, you scholars out there and educators, that we have a presidential library at Mount Vernon, opened in 2013. One, it is a center for research and education, and we do have paid fellowships opportunities for scholars who are working on their projects of any level. We come monthly, 3 month, 6 month fellowships are available on our webpage, mountvernon.org. You can look into the research fellowships and many, many other resources for teachers, K-12 and others out there. So please take a look at that. We have book talks every month. We got programs happening all the time. Become a member of Mount Vernon. Support the mission. You can do it. It's going to be great. You get my beautiful magazine 3 times a year. You can come to Mount Vernon for free anytime. So make it a part of your life. Let's see you at Mount Vernon in 2026 for sure. It should be on everybody's bucket list. It's been a pilgrimage site for Americans since George Washington came back here after he resigned his commission. And because you can't have Cincinnatus without the farm, and Mount
Right.
Vernon was the farm, and that was the place everybody knew about before there was a capital, before there was any monuments, before there was anything. There was Mount Vernon and the man who gave up power.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Well, if you like this webinar, you want to learn more about the JMC and how we support teaching of America's founding principles in history, I encourage you to visit our website as well as visit the website for Mount Vernon. Please sign up for our email list. And again, thank you to the donors of the Jack Miller Center. Thank you again to Doug for making this program possible. And have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for your time, Doug.
Thank you.